Imagine that every Bitcoin miner in the world suddenly switches off at exactly the same moment. Every mining facility becomes silent. Every mining pool stops operating. Every individual mining machine stops calculating hashes. Not most miners, not 90% of miners. Every single Bitcoin miner. What happens next? Would Bitcoin immediately collapse? Would all existing Bitcoin disappear? Would transactions stop working? Would somebody take control of the network? And could Bitcoin ever restart? To understand what would happen, we first need to understand what Bitcoin miners actually do. Bitcoin miners compete to produce new blocks. They collect valid, unconfirmed transactions, place them into candidate blocks, and repeatedly calculate hashes using specialized mining equipment. The miner is searching for a block hash that satisfies Bitcoin's current proof-of-work target. When a miner discovers a valid result, the miner broadcasts the new block to the Bitcoin network. Bitcoin nodes then independently verify that block. They check whether the proof of work is valid, whether the transactions follow the consensus rules, whether the signatures are correct, and whether the miner has claimed only the permitted block reward. If the block is valid, nodes add it to their copy of the blockchain. Miners therefore help move Bitcoin's transaction history forward. But miners do not control Bitcoin's rules by themselves. They can propose blocks, but full nodes decide whether those blocks are valid. Now imagine that all mining stops. During the first few minutes, most users might not notice anything unusual. Bitcoin aims for an average of approximately 10 minutes between blocks, but this is only a statistical average. Sometimes a valid block is found after 1 minute. Sometimes it takes 20 minutes, 30 minutes, or even longer. So an unusually long gap does not immediately prove that all miners have disappeared. Existing Bitcoin would remain completely unaffected during this period. The blockchain would still contain every previously confirmed transaction. Private keys would still control the same Bitcoin. Wallet balances would not reset. Bitcoin nodes would still store and verify the blockchain. The only immediate change would be that no new block was being created. Users could continue creating and broadcasting transactions. Bitcoin nodes could receive those transactions and verify whether they appeared valid according to the latest known blockchain state. The transactions could enter the mempools of different nodes. A mempool is a collection of valid, unconfirmed transactions waiting to be included in a block. But because no miner is producing a block, those transactions would remain unconfirmed. A wallet might show a transaction as sent. The receiving wallet might show it as pending, but the transaction would not become part of the blockchain. Merchants that require confirmations would stop considering new Bitcoin payments final. Cryptocurrency exchanges would likely pause Bitcoin deposits and withdrawals. Businesses accepting Bitcoin might stop delivering products until transactions could be confirmed. Large on-chain settlements would effectively freeze. What about payments accepted without confirmation? Some businesses may accept small Bitcoin payments as soon as the transaction is broadcast before it enters a block. These are often called zero confirmation transactions. But without miners, the risk of accepting them would become much higher. A sender could create two conflicting transactions attempting to spend the same Bitcoin. One transaction could be sent to the merchant. Another transaction could be shared with different nodes. Normally, mining eventually resolves the conflict because one transaction is included in a valid block and the other becomes invalid. But if no new block is ever produced, there is no final global decision about which transaction becomes part of Bitcoin's shared history. The blockchain itself would not disappear. It would simply stop growing. Every confirmed transaction before the final block would remain recorded. Bitcoin ownership would still be defined by the latest confirmed blockchain state. It would be similar to a ledger in which all previous pages remain intact, but no new page can currently be added. A common question is whether Bitcoin would automatically reduce its mining difficulty. Bitcoin adjusts its mining difficulty after every 2016 blocks. If those blocks were created faster than expected, mining becomes more difficult. If they were created more slowly than expected, mining becomes easier. This mechanism is designed to keep the average time between blocks close to 10 minutes. However, there is an important problem in our scenario. The next difficulty adjustment can only happen after the network reaches the required block height. If all miners have stopped and no new block is created, Bitcoin cannot move closer to that adjustment. The protocol does not simply look at a normal clock and decide to lower the difficulty because several days have passed. No new blocks means no progress toward the next difficulty adjustment. Therefore, Bitcoin would not automatically become easier to mine simply because every miner had stopped. Does this mean the network would be permanently frozen? Not necessarily. The moment any miner begins mining again, there is once more a chance of finding the next block. The mining difficulty would still be based on the previous level of global mining power. If only one very small miner returned, the expected waiting time for a valid block could be extremely long. But mining is probabilistic. Even a miner with very little hash power has some chance of finding a block. That miner could become extraordinarily lucky and find one quickly, or the network could wait for days, weeks, months, or potentially longer. As more mining equipment returned, the probability of producing a block would increase. Eventually, the blockchain could begin moving again. There would also be a strong economic incentive for miners to restart. The miner that successfully produced the next block could claim the permitted block subsidy and the transaction fees included in that block. During a long stoppage, many transactions might accumulate in Bitcoin mempools. Some users could attach increasingly high fees because they urgently wanted their transactions confirmed. This could make the first successful blocks financially valuable. Any participant with suitable mining equipment and electricity could attempt to restart block production. Bitcoin would not need permission from one particular company, government, or mining pool. The network could recover as soon as valid proof of work returned. Could the first returning miner change Bitcoin's rules? Suppose only one miner restarts and decides to create millions of additional Bitcoin. Would the network have to accept the block because no other miner was competing? No. Bitcoin nodes independently enforce the consensus rules. A block creating an excessive reward would be invalid. A block spending Bitcoin without valid signatures would be invalid. A block violating Bitcoin's supply rules would be invalid. Nodes would reject it. Even if that miner controlled 100% of the active hash rate, the miner would still need to produce blocks that Bitcoin nodes considered valid. Mining power helps decide the order of valid transactions. It does not give miners unlimited authority to rewrite the protocol. What would happen to the Lightning Network during this period? Some Lightning payments might continue through existing channels. Lightning payments do not require every individual transaction to be immediately included in a Bitcoin block. However, Lightning depends on the Bitcoin blockchain for final settlement. Users need the ability to open channels, close channels, and respond to dishonest channel closures. If mining stopped only for a short period, some Lightning activity could continue. But if the stoppage lasted for a long and unpredictable period, confidence in channel settlement would decline. New channels could not receive confirmations. Existing channels could not be reliably closed on-chain. Lightning could reduce the immediate impact, but it could not replace Bitcoin mining indefinitely. A more realistic scenario is that most miners stop, but some miners continue working. Suppose 90% of Bitcoin's hash rate disappears instantly. Blocks would still be produced, but they would initially arrive much more slowly. If only 10% of the previous mining power remained, the average block interval could become roughly 10 times longer, assuming other conditions remained equal. Instead of approximately 10 minutes, blocks might average around 100 minutes. Because some blocks were still being created, the network would continue advancing toward the next difficulty adjustment. When the adjustment eventually occurred, mining would become easier for the remaining miners. Block production could then move closer to the normal average. This is how Bitcoin can adapt when a large amount of mining power leaves the network. But the crucial point is that at least some miners must continue creating blocks. If absolutely no blocks are produced, the normal difficulty adjustment cannot occur. So what is the final answer? If every Bitcoin miner stopped, existing Bitcoin would not disappear. Private keys would remain valid. Confirmed transactions would remain recorded. Bitcoin nodes would continue holding the blockchain, but the blockchain would stop growing. New transactions could be created and broadcast, but they would remain unconfirmed. On-chain settlement would freeze. The normal difficulty adjustment would not automatically save the network because another block would first need to be produced. Bitcoin would begin moving again as soon as valid mining activity returned. If only a small amount of hash power came back, the next block might take a very long time. As more miners returned, block production would accelerate. Eventually, after enough blocks, the difficulty could adjust to the new level of mining participation. Miners are not the owners or rulers of Bitcoin. They cannot create unlimited Bitcoin or force full nodes to accept invalid blocks. But miners are essential to advancing Bitcoin's shared transaction history. Without mining, Bitcoin would become a preserved but temporarily frozen ledger. Today, miners are rewarded through a combination of newly issued Bitcoin and transaction fees, but Bitcoin's new issuance becomes smaller over time. Eventually, the block subsidy will reach zero. So what happens when the last new Bitcoin is mined? That is the question we will answer next.